Humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sangha, and Guru Piran Neo, fellow Jnanis. Today I'm going to cover part 8. In part 7, I covered, what that self is. We completed that discussion of that experiencing or having that vision or the cognition of that self. Today I'm going to speak about, what is the relationship between self-realization and God realization. And we spoke about that self, the door. I spoke about opening the doors, when the mind opens the doors to the self through the practice of meditation, we see that slowly, something really interesting happens. That when the doors of the self open, that means the mind now become the mind which is very fixated and gross, becomes more refined and more porous. As the mind becomes more and more porous, that illumination from that self percolates in the mind and slowly illuminates the mind, and eventually you see that the mind in its grossness dissolves, and the mind itself becomes that self. The mind realizes it is that self, and that's what self-realization is. And we also discussed about this, what God is. God is infinite, kind, gentle, all those things. So we see that when the doors of the self open, so sometimes people say, what is the God realization state is? How do we attain God? Does God appear in front of us? Does God, show up? The answer is yes, God shows up. But it shows up not in a gross form, but it shows up within us through the various qualities of God. Right? And this becomes an important measure. So we see that, when we attain that God realization, the first thing that happens is actually our thoughts becomes more and more graceful. Our thoughts become more and more gentle. And when our thoughts become more and more graceful and gentle and refined, we see that the words that follow from their thoughts also becomes graceful and gentle. And you see that also is dovetailed by the actions. So this is the first part that happens, that, God doesn't physically appear, but God manifests in our mind through these qualities, the gentleness, the gracefulness in our thoughts, words, and action. And something very interesting happens is that how we see that God is everywhere, God is helpful. We see that quality of the divinity starts percolating in us, a sense of generosity. We feel we have abundance of that inner resources in us, that abundance of that knowledge, abundance of that resources. And you see that the mind becomes very generous with its time, spending time on things that really matters, not spending time on frivolous things and trivial things and things that are not productive. So the mind becomes very generous with its time. It also becomes very generous in spending that quality time with the things and the people that matters. And you see that, and also the generosity, you're having the inner resources, the intellectual, the wealth of knowledge, and also the wealth of material wealth. There's a sense of wanting to give back, right? After all, we don't, we accumulated all the material things from here. We never came with anything. We accumulated it. We're going to give it back. So the first quality that takes place is that the sense of, graceful thoughts, words, and actions, but that's dovetailed with a sense of generosity, and with our time, resources, and also mentoring, willing to help others, willing to guide others. And that is why we see that the God and Guru are spoken in the same way. And a true Guru will actually, imbibe the quality, the first quality of God. So we see this first door of God realization shows up in all of us. The second one is actually the mind becomes outstanding. In Sanskrit, we call it sarvadakshita, par excellence. Everything that it does, it is introspected completely, wholesomely, understood before, it, actions it or speaks about it or, interact with it. This interactional sadhana takes place after the mind has completely understood what it is. So this outstanding sarvadakshina quality comes. And when that quality comes, it has the abundant resources to be able to create opportunity for oneself and everybody around them, including nature. So you see that one of the qualities that when one attains God realization is this awesome beauty of understanding everything really well and being able to generate the 10 capitals that I spoke about, from the spiritual capital right up to the emotional, intellectual, creative capital, right up to economic capital, and to be able to use that 10 capitals to create opportunities for others, right? This is the next quality. This is the quality of divinity that descends upon us as the doors of the self opens up. And finally, we see that, the mind, a disciplined mind, also the mind becomes very developmental. It is not a mind that is, constricted, shrunken. The mind is continuously learning new things, developing new things. That's how the universe is expanding, as I mentioned earlier. It's continuously building, constructing, developing, nurturing. So all these qualities starts, taking place in us. And if you look at what God is, that's what the divinity is, compassionate, graceful, that excellence and that discipline, able to control the senses, but also being able to develop, the mind, the intellect, the things around it. So we see that as these doors open, these godly values, the godly qualities starts showing up in us, and we see that with that godly lens, the things around us also becomes more graceful to us, gives us opportunity to learn and be outstanding in whatever we do, and continuously develop ourselves without being caught up with this material world, the sukha dukkha's. So the self and that God realization state is actually synonymous. So as the doors to the self opens up, the doors to the God realization too starts opening up. What is really interesting is that if you see, there is a continuum, right, that we all have. One is we have these demonic qualities, demons in us. There are many things within us that are, keeps us apart, which is destructive behavior, the shrunken behavior, the behavior that essentially, is very negative, very, torment people, and so on. So many human, ordinary people often, have a lot of negative things that they carry with themselves. So the mind becomes shrunken. Even during goodness, they would be very, very critical. So these are what we call demonic qualities, the demons that haunt us. Envy, is another quality. Menacing behavior. Sometimes we're very, very kind of try to make people's lives difficult and hard, even though things could be better. There's a sense of opulence. We want to overindulge in things, tire our senses, our mind, and then in the process become frustrated, and make life difficult for others. And also there's, we are always negative, even during positive things that are happening, we're very negative. So these are some of the destructive qualities that Mahan has spoken about. Other great saints have spoken about. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, he speaks about the demonic qualities that are embedded in us because we are in that state of unillumined. The mind is shrunken. So anger, hatred, jealousy, all these things are part and parcel of, on one continuum, the demonic. On the other continuum, you see that divine qualities, which is more graceful, generous, the sarva dakshina quality, creating opportunity for others, particularly those who can't do it on their own, very, very developmental and very disciplined. A sense of living a life of principles, to be able to be inspiration and, that awesomeness. But how do we essentially, so we've got one continuum, but most of us are probably not in the extremes. We're somewhere in the middle or slightly below. So most of us are there. The X is where most of us are there. But the key thing is that how do we get there? And the interesting thing is where we are, we have some notion of God or this vision of, at least from an abstract perspective. But because we have not fully realized it, we don't get the full, grace of that divinity. We're searching for that somewhere else. So how do we move to that God realization state or the self-realization state? And this is what Mahan and many saints speak about, that we have this duality in us, that this continuum, and some are more extreme than others. So how do we transition to the next phase? And this is what very important in all our discussions, in all our satsangs. We have to allocate time for introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. This is really essential. We cannot afford not to do this. If we want to transition, or if you want to cognize the divinity or God or the self, we've got to put in the effort of introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. Only then we start getting that supreme experiences of that self, that enlightening experiences, the liberating experiences, and the finality experience that we get. So we see that, in our transition, we see that the self is really important. So to summarize, we see that if we are to transition, we have to allocate some time towards, introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation. We've got to allocate some time for ourselves, for our mind to be absorbed in that self. We have to allocate some time for reading and reflecting great, scriptures, books by great people, listening to great people, and also, more importantly, nurturing divine thoughts, words, and also actions. Always be mindful of our thoughts and our actions. And that's what leads us to this, the state of God realization, or being able to cognize the divinity, the self, and God within us. Sandosham.